people are starting to pop into the webinar. So I will begin by extending a welcome to our attendees, as well as our panelists. My name is Kasia Kordas, and I co-direct the Community for Global Health Equity, together with Professor Samina Raja. CGHE is a transdisciplinary community of scholars, students, and community partners, which is dedicated to bringing attention to health inequities, as well as finding solutions to those inequities in Global South communities that include communities in Western New York. So we do this through collaboration with communities and institutional partners, and UN agencies have been an important partner for us for a very long time, since our founding, both for the community as well as for individual faculty. We are also really committed to training of students and educating students. These are at the forefront of our mission, and we're pleased to have this discussion today on how students can work collaboratively with UN agencies, either on individual projects or in preparation for careers. Students at the graduate and undergraduate level at UB have increasingly expressed interest in global health issues and solving global health problems, and so we're really excited to have that, to have an opportunity to have this discussion. Our webinar today stems from this interest, and I really want to acknowledge the hard work of two students in particular who put this, organized and planned this webinar. So Daniela Falcone is an MPH student in epidemiology in the accelerated program, and Sarah Quinones is a PhD student in the epidemiology department as well. Thank you so much for your work on this webinar, and they'll lead our discussion today. I also want to acknowledge Alex Judelson, who is the programs manager for CGHE, for organizing and keeping us together and on track. Thanks so much, Alex, for your work. And of course, welcome to our panelists. They will have an opportunity to introduce themselves and say a little bit about their work, but I'm just going to name them now in the order in which they appear on my screen. So Drs. Chris Renschler, Korydon Smith, Agnes Soares de Silva, Tia Palermo, Nathalie Roebbel, and Subhashni Raj. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here, especially if you're joining us from far away and it's dark and late for you. We have about an hour and a half for this discussion. We have some questions that we prepared ahead of time, but we really encourage the attendees to type in their questions and reflections into the chat or into the Q&A. We will make sure to get to as many of them as possible. So now I'm going to hand it over to Sarah, who will begin our discussion. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Dr. Kordas, and thank you to all attendees and panelists who were able to join us today for this hopefully lively discussion about working with UN agencies. We have a lot of questions prepared, and those submitted from attendees at registration, so we'll get into those. However, I'd like to give you all an opportunity to take about 2 to 3 minutes to introduce yourselves, perhaps sharing your educational backgrounds, what UN agency you have worked with or continue to collaborate with, where geographically and in terms of field work you've done your work, and areas of interest that you currently drive your research and work with. So I'll start just in the order that you're on my screen. So first, Dr. Chris Renschler.
Hello, good afternoon to everybody, and thanks for tuning in for this. Thank you for inviting me to the panel. My name is Chris Renschler. I'm a professor in the geography department here at the University of Buffalo. And my background is a PhD in geography and a master's in geoecology. I got that from the University of Bonn and University of Braunschweig in Germany. Well, I come from the natural resources management side and dealing with extreme events like soil erosion, for example. And climate plays a big role in what is going on right now and the challenges in the future. But I realized that working on extreme events also opens it up into all kinds of other systems that we have in landscapes that support us in a community. So community resilience is something that I'm working on. And I developed together with a couple of scientists a community resilience framework that includes other dimensions, not only physical, economic, but also social and cultural dimensions that play a role. And that's how I got actually an opportunity while I was in Vienna. I was invited to the Day of the Soils, to the Year of the Soils, actually, and they started a new decade of the soils at the UN meeting. And I would happen to be in town and made some comments at the final session on a soil declaration. And the people from the FAO and from the Food and Agricultural Organization, as well as the International Atomic Energy Agency, noticed me and requested to talk to me a little bit more about projects. So I went to Morocco. I had a virtual experience with China, but I traveled myself twice to China in the past 2 decades and working there on soil erosion. So the idea is isotopes in landscapes and how they move around and what they tell us about landscape processes. And I just want to stop here because otherwise it's getting too long. Go ahead.
Thank you. And now Dr. Subhashni Raj.
Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah mentioned, I'm Dr. Subhashni Raj. I am currently a postdoc at UC Davis in California and will soon be moving to the University of Hawaii as a newly minted faculty member in the Department of Urban Regional Planning. So I'm excited for that. Prior to that, I worked for UN Women at the regional office in Suva, Fiji, and I oversaw our inclusive disaster response programs, which helped communities prepare and respond to both natural disasters as well as adapting to climate change. And UN Women just recently launched their Women in Resilience program that's been funded by DFAT, which I helped kickstart and lead until I left. So I'm super excited about that. It's the first of its kind where funding is going specifically to not just women's organizations, but also organizations that particularly look after the interest or look into the interests of underrepresented minorities in our communities in the South Pacific. So LGBTQI communities, disability communities, and so forth. So my work thinks about inclusive design, something that I think Corey will be happy to hear, and thinking about equity through inclusive design and thinking about the nuanced needs of our community members as we prepare for not just disasters, but also climate change and adapting to climate change. So it's complex and we take a very nuanced approach. We also, in that work, I also did a lot of training, led a lot of training in getting our partners to think about gender and gender responsive humanitarian action. So that's one component of my direct work with the UN. I still keep in touch with the different program managers in New York and Geneva. UN Women is one of the youngest and newest agencies, so it's not very old relative to, FAO and WHO. So it's actually overseen, a lot of its management is overseen by UNDP. So I also have a lot of interaction with the UNDP, especially with how it relates to the larger climate change portfolio. There's a lot of overlap. There's a new directive for UN agencies to work together more on issues that overlap. So things like gender mainstreaming, working that into other UN agencies' portfolios, supporting them. So I did a lot of that as well. Prior to that, I was at University of Buffalo, actually, in the Department of Urban Regional Planning. I was a master's student and then a doctoral student there. before moving on to my UN position. And while I was at UB, I had a long-term relationship with the UN headquarters in New York City, and I worked for Fiji's permanent mission to the UN there, and I supported their work on climate change and then climate change negotiations. And before that, I was part of Fiji's delegation to COP, negotiating texts on climate change. So I was there when negotiations failed. It didn't go exactly. And so I've had a long-standing relationship with UN processes and agencies that then transpired into positions and research areas. And if you can tell, my research has to do with climate change and its impact on communities, but really thinking about equity and inclusive design as we do it, and more specifically thinking about food and water pathways in indigenous and non-indigenous communities. So that's a lot. Sorry, Sarah, but back to you.
Thank you. Dr. Tia Palermo.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tia Palermo. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Environmental Health at the University at Buffalo. My educational background, I have a master's in economics and a PhD in public policy, and I did my postdoctoral training in demography at the City University of New York. Prior to joining UB about 2.5 years ago, I was a staff member for 5 years with the United Nations Children's Fund, better known as UNICEF. I continue to collaborate with UNICEF on several projects. The office I was staff at was a headquarter office for research in Italy, where I primarily conducted work in Africa, including Ghana, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and some more limited work in Malawi and Zambia. My research examines how social protection, defined as the set of policies and programs aimed at preventing or protecting all people against poverty, vulnerability, and social exclusion through the life cycle, affects population health and well-being. Some of the health outcomes I look at include food security, stress, violence, and adolescent sexual and reproductive health. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Tia. Dr. Korydon Smith.
Hello, everyone, and thanks to Kasia, Daniela, Sarah, and Alex for all of the organization and the invitation to be here. And likewise, thanks to all of the panelists. I look forward to the conversation. I'm Korydon Smith. I currently serve as professor and chair of the Department of Architecture at the University of Buffalo. I'm also a founding member of the Community of Excellence in Global Health Equity as well. I hold a professional Master of Architecture degree, as well as a doctoral degree in higher education leadership. One example of a current project that I'm working on is in Colombia, working with landmine survivors and victims of conflict, working especially from the built environment and disability perspective. While I've worked in Latin America on other projects in the past, the majority of my recent work has been in the Great Lakes region of Africa. So I live in the Great Lakes region of the global north and work in the Great Lakes region of the global south. My aim is to improve equity and inclusion in the built environment, particularly for marginalized and vulnerable populations, including the examples I've mentioned so far. Among other projects and other organizations with whom I've worked, I've also worked with UNICEF and WHO in the joint monitoring program, focused specifically on measuring accessibility of schools for girls as well as children with disabilities. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
Thank you. Dr. Agnes Soares.
Hey, hello everyone. I think it's good afternoon for most of you. My name is Agnes Soares. I think I'll talk about a little bit about my background because I think it's also different and I've heard from some of you. I'm a medical doctor from Brazil, and I have a specialization in occupational health and in public health. And a master's degree, Master of Science degree in public health with focus on environmental health, and also a PhD on tropical medicine with focus on international health. But I work for the Pan American Health Organization, which is also the office of the WHO for the Americas. And I'm currently the interim chief of the Unity of Climate Change and Environmental Determinants of Health. I started my career in Brazil as a medical doctor. I think most of people don't think about it, but actually my interest in working with environmental health came because of contact I had in the area where I worked with problems with the communities living close to hazardous dump sites that were uncontrolled dump sites. And that's where I started my career, and I'm more devoted to environmental health and my research, early research, and I still do some, but much less now, because working at the Pan American Health Organization is more working with countries. So we support the development of the area of environmental health in the countries, and also working much more in this interface between research and policy making. So translating the research into policy. The areas of work we have mostly work at PAHO, at this unity, are the ones that are have the highest impact on the burden of diseases, climate change, as air pollution, ambient and household air pollution, chemical safety, and water and sanitation and hygiene. Of course, there are many other issues that we work with, and particularly in public health surveillance, and the issues such as children's health and environment that requires working with all the different fields. Part of the work we do is on building green and resilient health services, health systems. Of course, because we live in one of the most, the regions with the highest inequities in health and socioeconomic inequities, we also work to reduce inequities that are related to environmental risks. So this is basically, in a short, what I do.
Thank you. And Dr. Nathalie Roebbel.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and good afternoon to everybody. So my name is Nathalie Roebbel, and I am the unit head in WHO headquarters, Geneva, on urban health. And actually, it's really nice to see that in this international meeting, I meet colleagues from the place where I did my studies, which is Bonn, Germany. So Chris, it's funny, right, that we have to travel virtually all this way to meet each other here in this meeting. So I did my training in social sciences and psychology, and I have a PhD in sociology in Bonn University. And I have then started working for WHO at various levels. So I have been working with WHO for almost 19 years. And I've been working in different offices. So while I'm serving currently in WHO headquarters in Geneva, I have been working in the regional offices for Europe before, and actually in two different offices. One, the Bonn office, which is really looking at environment and health issues, and then in a Copenhagen office, which is the regional office for Europe. And across all my work, the main area of work that I've been, dealing with is urban health, from different entry points, I would say. I did start by working on a very concrete program on housing and health, coming from a social science perspective. And we're looking at household and health, looking at housing as a key public health determinant. And then from there, I've been taking up different roles and responsibilities, but always having urban health, having determinants at the core of my work. So moving from the environmental department, looking at the social determinants of health. Now I'm back in the social determinants of health department. But again, always, if I can say, carrying with me the urban health portfolio. And interestingly, what we are currently doing with this area of work is that while WHO has been working on urban health for many years, many decades, and Agnes was mentioning the substantial work on environment and health in this area, but we also have seen a lot of work looking at urban health from an equity perspective, social determinants perspective, even NCDs, but now more recently pandemic response and preparedness. There is the need somehow of bringing all these streams of work together. And urbanization has been really identified as a key determinant of health. So my new role, if I may say, is to support the organization across headquarters, so in Geneva, but the regions as well, to somehow align, bring together and capitalize on all the work on urban health. So this is my current role. And just to conclude, I would say that whatever I do, though, housing will always be will always have a very special place in my heart. So you will hear me speaking much more about that. So back to you, Sarah. Over.
Thank you all. It's so interesting to hear your diverse experiences and backgrounds in UN agency work. Before I start throwing questions at you, I do want to take the time to acknowledge our co-sponsoring organizations who contributed to this event, including the Community for Global Health Equity, the Office for Global Health Initiatives, the Graduate Students of Color, as well as the departmental graduate student associations of the Department of Epidemiology and Environmental Health and Community Health and Health Behaviors. And with that, I will just reverse the order and give the first question to both Dr. Nathalie Roebbel and Dr. Agnes Soares. Can you describe the process or the path and how you got involved with the work initially with the UN agency?
So shall I start in the reverse order? Okay.
Sure, please.
So I did omit to say in my presentation that I, previously to working in WHO, I did a maternity replacement in UNESCO in Paris. And at that time I was doing my PhD, and I was very much looking at household structures, health. So it's with a family, sociology perspective with some public health entry points. And when I came back to Bonn from the maternity replacement, I continued doing my PhD, and I very quickly realized that doing only my PhD was not what I really wanted to do. I wanted to continue my PhD, but I needed to be, working hands-on. I needed to be applying this in a practical way. And at that time, Bonn in Germany became somehow a UN, hub, because the capital had moved back to Berlin, and therefore Bonn was somehow repurposed to accommodate UN organizations. So I actually went from one organization to the other and ended up at the WHO office, which is the Environment and Health Center in Bonn. And I did speak to the director at the time, and I said, here I am, that's what I'm doing, I'm interested. And then luckily at that specific time, they were doing a large survey on housing and health, which was called the LARES study. And when I did present myself, I said, somebody who knows, is a social scientist, who is an interest on, on housing, household structures, public health. That could be interesting. So that's how I entered the organization. And I started actually with an internship there. And so starting from an internship, then after that, I started getting, my position. And then as I described earlier on, I did, my different moves and career developments. But so the entry point was that I always was interested in UN organizations. Definitely the research work was interesting for me, but I needed to see it in an applied context. And then, so it was probably with a pinch of luck, I would say, and a little bit of persuasion from my end. Back to you.
Thank you. And Dr. Soares, do you have any stories to share on how you found your way?
I think we all have different stories of points of entry. I was not lucky enough to be an intern at any of the organizations. I was directly involved in work because when I started, my first contact, work contact, because contact with PAHO and WHO I had since my training as a medical doctor, because we received by that time a lot of support, including through access to publications and everything we did through using services that was from the Pan American Health Organization. But for work, I would say it started because of my work during my master's degree. As I mentioned, I was studying the public health impact of population living close to these hazardous dam sites. And it was on hexachlorobenzene. I used it as a marker. And by that time, there was many studies being prepared to inform the Stockholm Convention. So this study I wrote about, and it was I was invited to be part of the negotiation process in preparations for one of the convention of the parties that it ended up including this, the first 12 chemicals that would be part of the convention to be eliminated. So that was my first small contract I had from PAHO to be part of this process. And then later on, I continued with different, always supporting work done in different sites using the same methodology. And I ended up working in the Netherlands in the office that later moved to Bonn. So I am a little older, so much older. So I was in the office that was based in the Netherlands, and I worked there with probably the same person. Michal was the chief in the moment. And it was a wonderful experience because I was working on this. It was a research, and we were looking at what was happening with dioxins in human milk and the whole world. So it was a great experience moving from, what I thought was a problem from third world countries or developing countries and looking at this big picture. And working with people that I've learned a lot. It was not for too long because then the office moved to Bonn, but I continued working in many other short-term contracts with WHO and PAHO doing some specific work. And I ended up, after going through many other international type of work, always linking with global health and global environmental health, I would say, and working in epidemiological studies, I applied for the position at PAHO because I wanted to come back to this side of the world where I came from. And in a selection process, it opened for the environmental epidemiology, and that's the way I started at PAHO 14 years ago. And although if I count to the time I have been working in and out with WHO and the regional office in Europe and other areas, I have done work like international work, sometimes short terms, but in Africa, in Asia, and also in many other countries in Latin America. I think that's the way I ended up at the position I am at PAHO. So it's quite, and I know from many other colleagues, each one has a different entry point, but the only thing we really share is this interest that we have on working at this dimension that is, it's not so palpable. I always say if you need some feedback from your work and you need the immediate feedback, you need to be working in healthcare and not with the public health, because we need to wait a lot to see the results of what we do. And but it's when we see the impact, and that's what I think that's what moves us. So there's huge conversations worldwide and the conventions that not always get where we want, but this make this type of work in multilateral organizations or in global organizations help the world move faster, because we can bring at different levels, together, and we see this movement. So I believe that's mostly what attracted me to work in this type of, this level of organizations. Although I have been, I think I can say I have experience at local level, at city level, at the state level, at national level, and at the international level. And I think it's not necessarily the way you should do it. And maybe if I had the same opportunity as Nathalie that goes directly from PhD to, maybe I would have done that, but it's not the same way for everyone. So that's it.
Thank you. And then I'll direct my next question to Corey and Tia as well. Can you explain some of the challenges that you face working with these diverse populations and stakeholders, and perhaps share ways that you have overcome these challenges? We can start with Corey.
Sure, thank you. So I think, when any of us who don't necessarily come from the cultural background, the political circumstances, the climate, the geography, the dominant language of a particular place, we have to, begin to approach that from a standpoint of humility in understanding that there are power differentials, there's economic differentials, there's educational differentials from the backgrounds that we bring by comparison to the stakeholders that we might be working with. So that's just, a fundamental part of the value system. I think, broadly speaking, from my standpoint, but also I would say from the standpoint of the community of excellence in global health, it's working with stakeholders throughout the process. And that is from identifying what the challenges are, to the process of identifying what the research methods might be, to the implementation and strategies that might be, to carrying out the work, to then assessing implications of that work, and then back to the beginning of the cycle. Rather than approaching it that either the academic institution or us as individuals, we're responsible for one phase of the work and stakeholders are responsible for another phase of the work, that there's an integration between all stakeholders throughout the process. Because I'm largely, this is the autobiographical answer to the question, because I'm largely working in conflict regions as well, it's critically important that I'm working with trusted members of those communities as well. And that is both about just simple safety and security of whatever the team is, whether that are local individuals or people who are traveling internationally, but also from the sustainability side of things. You focus on making sure that you have really strong partners with a strong track record who are trusted in the community to be able to, again, carry that work forward. So I'm always working and making sure to vet the people who are partnering. So knowing how to turn down projects because they're not appropriate for you. As excited and as curious as I am as an individual, it's also important to be able to know when I'm not the right fit, and being able to turn projects toward other colleagues or other people who might be more suitable for the type of project that's being done. So again, that last comment ties back to that concept of humility.
So I think that's a really good summary about, cultural and linguistic differences. I also think that there are cultural differences between, researchers and practitioners. And in my experience, one of the challenges that I have viewed, both from within and collaborating with UN agency, is bridging the gap between the questions that people have and what you can answer with different research designs, as well as the timelines and the budgets that oftentimes people want to allocate for research versus how long it really takes. So for that, I would just say that going back to what Dr. Smith said, working with stakeholders throughout the whole process, I think the same strategy really works well when you're trying to do rigorous research collaborations with UN agencies, or even commissioning research from within the UN. So if you're working as UN staff and commissioning research, I think a really important way to go about that is giving people the different options. Here's what we can do. Here's the timeline. Here's the budget. Here's the research design. Here are the questions you have, and here's what we can answer. And I feel like I spend a lot of time saying, here's what I'm hearing you ask, and here's what I think we can answer. And so I think it's really important to kind of understand, researchers come from a little bit different background than programmers and practitioners, and we have different incentive structures. We have different questions that we're interested in. And I think that usually you can find common ground and find something that works for everybody. But I do think you have to be open and be flexible. And as Dr. Smith said, really bring people in at all stages of the process, in the design, sharing findings at different points of the research. We've had very successful writing workshops, we call them. So we collect the data, we analyze it, and then we go back to our government and UN partners before we release it publicly. And we say, here's what we found. What do you think? How can we frame this? So yeah, taking a little bit different take on that question. But I do think, as most of the people on this webinar are coming from an academic background, I think that's a really important kind of cultural difference to have in mind as you engage in this work.
Thank you both. Those are really great insights into bridging the gaps between these populations. And then on to Subhashni and then Chris. Can you please describe or tell us what you consider to be some important skills, whether hard or soft, that are necessary to doing your work with your UN agencies?
I guess I'll go first, and really it's following up on what Dr. Smith and Dr. Palermo have already talked about. I think one of the key skills, especially when you're working in contexts you're unfamiliar with or cultures you're not embedded in, you really have to listen. I think listening is such a key skill for doing field work and for working in field missions. It's really difficult sometimes because the UN has its own frameworks, whether it's like in research or practice, and we found this in the humanitarian settings we were working for. Usually UN humanitarian settings are places of conflict, but in the Pacific they're not. It's not conflict frameworks, they're disaster frameworks that are cyclic. And so to fit the system that works in conflict into systems that are meant to respond to disasters, it just doesn't pair well, especially when you try to force it. So in that case, like Dr. Palermo said, you really have to listen and take into account what's already happening on the ground and really be humble and respectful of the ways they're already operating in. There's something to be said for indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and epistemologies that we need to value in academic work as well. That's embedded in and especially in qualitative work that's all built from the ground up. So I think listening and paying attention to those ways of knowing that are so specific to the places we work in has been a key skill, which is both soft and hard. You have to learn it. But it's also not something you can be taught at the same time. So it comes from, continuously practicing it. So with that, I'll hand all over to Chris.
Trying to find my unmute here. So yeah, I just want to connect a few things, and like Dr. Raj just said, listening, then from Korydon Smith, trust, and from Agnes, the scale. I want to bridge those three in answering the question about hard and soft skills. I'm from a small village in southern Germany, 250 people. So, they ask me all questions. Why are you going away and study? That's where it already starts. So you should, as a student, never avoid answering this question, taking it serious. My university was 6 hours away. So on the way, I met a lot of people. And I said, if I'm not able in 2 minutes to explain what I'm doing, I failed as a scientist and I failed as a person. So to not get your elevator speech so that you can go up. And now we come to the scale. If you think about here, we're talking international. You should not look up for the international scale. You should look into the community and the local scale, because that's where you actually will learn the things and learn the basics for this work. So reaching out to community stakeholders, reaching out across boundaries, even if it's uncomfortable, do it. This is how you learn and how you experience what is necessary. In my personal experience, I would really say like that you can start anywhere. Start there where you feel like you have got the most that you bring to the table, but with listening, you can learn so much. And to bridge those scales, starting from local or individual, neighborhood, all of these kind of projects that are offered to you, don't neglect them and you're waiting for an international project or something like that. Start locally and you will go to other communities somewhere else in the world. And I went to Fiji and I gave a presentation. I learned so much from it because I kind of like tested my knowledge. How does my local knowledge from somewhere else in the world connect to local knowledge somewhere else? And, for me personally, I've worked on extreme events, and extreme events are the opportunity for you to really be relevant or can be relevant when you are there to try to help and to support a situation. But as a scientist, you need to be prepared for that. So that means you're always kind of like, when the extreme event comes, you need to have your facts right. You need to have a lot of trust relationships that you have built up, and then you can really actually do something. And that all takes time. And, I heard a little bit from some of us, like, it is not regular what a faculty member is doing. So it will take extra time. And sometimes that's not necessarily appreciated by your advisor or by anyone around you. And they say like, oh, you should concentrate on that and then do this. I wouldn't be here if I wouldn't have listened to my master's advisor saying like, why don't you stay in Germany and finish your master's first? But I went to the Netherlands and I went to the ITC, to the International Training Center, and I heard from practitioners around the world, because there was nothing like in Germany for remote sensing and for GIS and to work in communities. And I learned a whole lot of things about data and information. You can grow up in the Western world and have a pool of data that is for free, but you can also go to areas where the information is poor, and you still have to apply scientific skills to use those. And those are the hard skills that you really should bring to place. And there is a lot of data that you had to pay for. And obviously, then you look very close what you get. But if you get it for free and you take it for granted, you can do a lot of mistakes. And it's really important that you check these pools of information and that you work your way up. Practical skill that I learned 10 years ago when I joined the local emergency planning committee. That is something that you find in any county in the United States. And that was invented after the Bhopal chemical disaster, so that people can communicate and they can respond better. So that is in the US, you find them anywhere. And 10 years ago, I went there as a US, at that time, I wasn't even a US citizen, I was still a German. But I went in there and I said, I'm interested in that. And I listened to and worked with those people in there on very practical problems about hazardous material. And it wasn't really my expertise, but I learned a lot that way. And you get a lot of local contacts and you build those trust relationships. And when push comes to shove, these are the same people that will respond when something really bad happens. So we had an earthquake scenario in Buffalo, for example, and people would think like, no, the risk is not high in Buffalo. Yes, but there's a likelihood. And if something happens, then these people, you know them, you can work together, you can trust them, you can collaborate and all of that. So it doesn't matter at which scale you're going to start, but start on some scale but then also get the experience and do that somewhere else. So trust, listening, scale. Good luck, all of you. If you're excited about working international, there are so many paths up there.
Thank you. I appreciate in all of your responses, you had very human aspects to it: humility, empathy, patience, trust, relationship building. It's great to hear, promising. So I'll stay with Chris and Subhashni and ask about your engagement with students in your work, how you engage students, and perhaps if you have a philosophy that guides your engagement or leadership with students. So Chris, I'll stay with you for now.
Okay, so when I came to UB and I was asked, what do you want to teach? I said I would like to teach a practical oriented course. And, you may have in architecture and planning more like studio classes and things like that. But I did it not necessarily discussing too much with my colleagues how to do something like this. But it's basically getting local stakeholders and rights holders sharing their challenges and then letting the students work together with them. It took me obviously a long time until that got started up, but now we have got stakeholders coming and evaluating projects of students. They are not even my students. They're students just interested in a topic and they pick that topic and start working, and they have communications outside the classroom working on data sets that nobody really worked for on that because some of the stakeholders either didn't have time or it's just not publicly available. And that creates those relationships. And a lot of these students are working now in climate change and community resilience and for different levels of agencies. I think it was that personal contact that they could experience in working. And I encourage the students to go out there and knock on doors and get those. But I also tell the stakeholders, most likely 80% of what they will say already. But that's not the point. The point is that, and that's what stakeholders confirmed in every year coming back, is like, we come back because we hear things we haven't thought about it or we never heard about it. And that's where the students come in, because you have got the opportunity to bring that in a project. It's a class project, it's your master's, it's your PhD. And that's exactly its exciting part. And if a stakeholder is willing to listen to that, then take that opportunity. You can learn much more than just going to classes here at the university.
And Subhashni, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so I'll answer it in two parts. One from my practitioner experience in the Pacific, and two from my limited teaching experience and engagement with students. So as a practitioner who's trained in social sciences and carries with them this idea of equity, we have to build it into the programming that we oversee wherever we end up, whether it's a UN agency or some other institution. And so part of that work for me involves putting money towards funding for those opportunities for students to come work with us, but with a focus on local students. There's this real misnomer that people in the Global South aren't educated and cannot do the work that I'm really focused on breaking, because that's not the truth. The truth is there is an opportunity gap. There's lots of highly trained and skilled students and experts in the Pacific and other Global South communities who just don't have the same opportunity. So a lot of the work that I do, the programming that I build, involves building funding and funding lines to provide those opportunities to local students and local experts. So that means when we create consultancies, they're not international consultancies. We build in language that supports local consultants. So giving those opportunities to local experts to do that work in the Pacific, but also for students to have those internships in all the programming that we build, they must be a local Pacific Islander. So that's one aspect of it. So this idea of equity does not end just in terms of, you know, this proposal we're writing. It has to be embedded in all that we do. And so we build transformative institutions top down, right? So that's one end of it. The other end of it, in terms of engagement with students, is mentoring. A lot of the students that I work with, both here in the lab that I'm based in and in the research lab I was at UB, a lot of us are first generation, a lot of us are immigrants. Our needs are very different. We don't have people in our lives always helping us, mentoring us, teaching us those soft skills. You know, one of the things that I've taken away from my time at UB is this idea that we should, when we have a meeting, when we ask for a meeting with someone, we should send out a calendar invite. We should be like, you know, very on top of all of that. And that's just building soft skills. Students don't always come in knowing that they have to schedule time, how to use the calendar, Zoom, all of these things. So, you know, it's a very small thing, but I've taken that away with me. And the students I interact with now, in the process of mentoring, I pass that on. So I pass it forward, the idea of you need to build the soft skills, be there for them in mentoring those soft skills, in learning how to network and putting themselves out there, reaching out to people in all of those aspects. And obviously, you know, there's the research mentoring, which is that if you work with me on a research project, you get credit for it. So that means whether you are a community member or you're a student, if we're working on a project together, your name's going to be on the paper based on, you know, your contribution to it. So, you know, so fairness, transparency, accountability. But that means that the students are also on the hook because, you know, if they agree to work on something, they have to see it through. So it's building all of those things up bottom up too. So that's kind of my philosophy for teaching and mentoring. Thanks, Sarah, for the question.
May I just add one more thing? The highly underutilized resource is really the office hours of your professors. And I just can't say it often enough because that's your entry into a network. And you know, you shouldn't shy away from that. You should always do it. I even tell people before they come to the university to approach us professors and talk to them, because we would like to have students that are already ahead of the curve in thinking ahead. And don't shy away from any kind of office hours.
Thank you both. And related to the responses of Krish and Subhashni, for Corey and Tia, can you, I guess, elaborate on things that universities can do to better prepare students for work in an international setting? And since you're both here at UB, perhaps comment on what UB is doing right in terms of bridging these international gaps.
Tia, would you start? Because you bring both perspectives, I think, much more deeply than I do.
Sure, I can start maybe. I think what UB does well is providing these fora and communities like the Community for Global Health Equity. We have the new master's program in international development and global health. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. There's courses. I've had the privilege of teaching the global health course to undergrads. Dr. Korydon teaches the class to graduate students or has in the past. So I think there's a lot of opportunity that UB gives to students. And one thing that I love about UB and I love about, you know, the SUNY system and public education in general is that our students have such diverse backgrounds. You know, they're very passionate. A lot of first generation people, you know, Dr. Raj mentioned being first generation. I'm also first generation, came up through SUNY. So I think that you know, partnering with schools like UB, people can tap into a type of diversity that you don't necessarily have at all universities. And at the same time, I feel like it's a privilege as a professor at a university like SUNY, where you can provide opportunities and networks for students that maybe, a student at a private, elite university is probably going to get those networks no matter what. But at a SUNY school, we as professors really have the opportunity to provide those networks to people that maybe they wouldn't have access to those networks otherwise. So I think that's one thing that UB does for students. And I would just say, in preparing students for UN positions, I would say at the end, so that's kind of what UB does for students, but just thinking about students who want to work for the UN, I think at the individual level, what you can do is use your networks, use these networks that you're building, use your professors, use the connections of these people you're meeting at webinars, email people, reach out to people through LinkedIn, through email. I've heard from other UN staff members, a lot of people get their jobs through networks. So you really have, that's one of those soft skills that maybe you aren't good at yet, but you need to practice using your networks, emailing people, attending conferences, webinars, things like that, where you can meet people in person. I think that's really important. So attend those webinars, conferences, increase your network, and then follow up with people. Also, as an individual, you can learn a UN language. So in my experience, knowing a UN language will help you get a job in the UN, even if you don't end up using that particular language in your UN position. So for example, I speak Spanish, that helped me get a job in the UN, even though I ended up working in the Africa region. It helps you get a foot in the door because increasingly you need to know 2 UN languages. So luckily for us, English is one, but you also need to know oftentimes Arabic, Chinese, French, Russian, or Spanish. So if you have one of those, or you don't even have to be fluent. So if you're learning and you have communication skills. So I highly encourage people to take advantage of the classes at UB and learn a language. You can apply for consultancies, as I said in the Q&A chat. A lot of people get a foot in the door this way. You can do that as a grad student. And then on the flip side, once you're in the UN, you need to strengthen those skills that Dr. Raj was talking about in terms of some of those soft skills. So I would also just say that, the UN requires generalist skills and flexibility in what you work in. And I think Dr. Roebbel kind of alluded to that, where just general advice, if you're kind of trying to decide between UN or academia, if you want to be the world expert on one very narrow specific topic, if that's what you're very passionate about, then maybe academia is a better fit for you. Because when you work in the UN, you have to work on different projects. You don't always get to decide the direction of your work. Oftentimes the mandates come from the top down, and you have to be flexible and have generalist skills and work on different projects. So that's some soul searching that you have to do for yourself. What do you want to do? Because those are two very different things. In academia, you have more flexibility to decide the direction you want to go and go in that direction. So I'll pass it over to Dr. Smith now.
Thank you. And I'll only add one small bit here, because again, I think that there are lots of colleagues here with great advice about entering into the pathways into UN and various organizations. The one addition is really for students who are currently at UB or at another large public research university, and that is at a large comprehensive institution, you have access to all kinds of different people and all kinds of different projects, probably more opportunities than you can even absorb in a 4 or 6 year cycle in the institution. But nevertheless, there are certainly all kinds of great general education courses that allow you to enter in to test to see if this is an area of interest for you, as well through Community of Excellence in Global Health Equity, Office of Global Health Initiatives in School of Public Health and Health Professions. Lots of individualized mentoring, individualized travel to be able to participate in research projects. And again, for undergraduate, graduate students and doctoral students. So a range of opportunities from large class opportunities to small group projects to the individualized types of projects. Connect with faculty not only within your academic department, but across other academic departments as well, to ask them questions. As you see from this group, there are people who work at a lot of different and curious and interesting intersections between disciplines.
Thank you both. And I'll direct hopefully this sort of fun question to Agnes and Nathalie. Can you share something you wish you knew before entering the UN agency domain?
Shall I start? Well, I think the way UN in general operates, I think it can be very tiring. I don't know how much this can be taught really at the university. I wasn't. And I think this is something that we should be aware of. So developing negotiation skills, but it's like when you need and you should really be assertive because of the scientific basis you have, and what is not essential that you can really, it's up to negotiation. And to know what is the boundaries in this process means also to be able, I think everyone talked a lot about listening. So when you're working in an international environment that is not only discussing with the difference in cultural backgrounds, but normally many of the people participating in the process are using not their first language, unless you were lucky enough to be born in a place where English is your first language. You'll normally be working in some other, as a second or a third language. So you have to be patient to participate in the process, because it's like discussing sometimes hours on what exactly goes in the papers that are ended up as being resolutions. That matters a lot. But we have to know exactly the place where as technical people, we have limited access to what goes to the end, but we know where it should stop, and sometimes we don't get there. So I think understanding what the governing bodies are, what are the participating at least following up what goes and what is under discussions in the World Health Assembly or in many other UN bodies help also to understand this type of process. So it's although you have to develop this type of skill that is more on the soft, I would say soft type of skills. It's not only being organized, but also to have this language of diplomacy that we frequently lack of when we are doing specific research, or when in the academic world, you don't necessarily need to do that. But I see even for people who are very technical and participate in those technical bodies, who, like when we are preparing guidelines, then it's the basic conversation is what is the state of the knowledge in a certain field. So you need really people that knows a lot about a specific field. But in the end, it is a negotiation as well among all the different types of knowledge to get to the guidelines that will be so important, as we have guidelines for air quality or for water quality. So I think this is something I wish I had known better. So I will be more prepared to do when I started. I had to learn by doing, I would say.
So maybe just to build on what Agnes just shared, and I definitely fully agree with the points raised. I would say that, for WHO, it's a bit of a bureaucratic elephant, right? And a lot is process, based, and you have to learn those processes, but you also need to learn why sometimes those processes are needed, right? It's not, and sometimes you may have to cope with your own frustration when you maybe we don't necessarily agree with those processes, but so I think there is a bit this reality check that it is an organization, a bureaucratic organization, as many others. So I definitely would like to agree with Agnes' point, but maybe I would like to raise three different, things that I would have liked to know before, not that they. The first one, and it relates to the first point, is that you need to move forward with the changing environment in the sense that you're working on something, you are, dedicated to something, you are having your pathway, and then for any kind of reason, you need to change, right? And this is happening everywhere. But I somehow, in my naive, young understanding, had the impression that because we are talking about such a well-established, important international organization, once you have your pathway, they're set, that things, will go their own way. But now, because you are dealing with countries, right? You're dealing with countries that might be facing, an emergency due to an environmental emergency, a pandemic, as we are doing now. We have been all going through so many things that need to be. So obviously, there is the need for changing pathways, and I think this is something that I really had to learn. Maybe it was my own naive, thinking, but I think, and actually, if you look at one of the competencies that WHO is requiring when hiring people, one of the competency is called moving forward in a changing environment. And I actually, at the beginning, found it a bit, it's a bit, general statement, but it's actually real, right? It's a real need. The second thing maybe that I wanted to raise is also that there is a need to better understand what an organization like WHO can do and cannot do. Because again, this is idealistic, thinking that if you work on health and public health, and if you understand that being exposed to air pollution, right, is damaging for health, right, WHO can, with the development of the guidelines, change the world. So, and yes, it can, by providing, the best scientific knowledge and by translating this in concrete recommendations. But there needs to be the understanding that WHO will not be the police, right? It's not the implementing organization, it's not the enforcing organization. So with very little exceptions, right? So for me, again, this is something that I didn't know. I had this idea that, and I think that the pandemic has shown us that sometimes there was also a bit of a wrong interpretation of what the role actually of WHO in the response to the pandemic was. And maybe the last point, if you allow me, is also the understanding that I was thinking that, if you work for the World Health Organization, you would speak one language when reaching out to the health sector, but also the other sectors that, might be relevant for health. And actually I very quickly understood, in working in determinants like social, environmental, housing, urban, that's not the case. So you're going to be talking a very different language if you speak to the health sector, or you're going to be speaking to the transport, housing, and other sectors for health purposes. So again, these are some adaptations, right, that I had maybe to do to my own vision, but also to my own skills to respond to that. Over.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for this illuminating exchange. I'll now pass it over to Daniela to facilitate questions submitted by the attendees. And I'll also encourage attendees to continue to submit questions in the Q&A. Over to you, Daniela.
Thank you, Sarah. So thank you, Dr. Palermo, for getting back to the question, but I will pose it as well to Dr. Roebbel and Dr. Soares. So the question from the audience is, does the direction of the work that we do in our graduate programs, whether that be a master's or a PhD, have to necessarily shape what we do in the UN? So I'll hand it off to Dr. Soares first.
Not necessarily. I think it depends on where you start with. If you are really narrowed, as I think as said, on what your interest is, then it may be difficult to position yourself later on in this type of work. But there are some skills, I think, that are really necessary. And some of them you learn at school, and others you learn, it's like a self-learning process. If you're not interested in geopolitics, don't go to work in any of these UN organizations, because your work is highly, highly affected by anything happening anywhere. So for the pandemic situation to any of the guidelines I mentioned, it's technical, but it's always related to that. So you need to understand that. So if you have no interest in politics, don't go to this field. I would say even don't go to public health, because you need to understand at least some of it. You need to have some compassion. So if you have no empathy for the suffering of others in any situation, you'll be hardly moved to do things that will tire you off. And sometimes, like Nathalie put it very well, there are many barriers you have to deal with, and it's different. It's nothing that depends only on you. So you need to develop these skills. And networking is not about knowing people. So if you are rich and you go to a very fancy school, you'll probably have a natural network. But I agree with, I don't remember who said that if you are really interested, you can build it up from anywhere in the world. I had students coming from internships and from different places, and they did well from different backgrounds, but what moved them was how much they wanted to learn. So, and I see maybe it's a little bit too much, because I have no scientific basis to say that, but I believe that people who read like literature and are open enough to read from some other, different countries, are more open to learn different ways of looking at problems and looking at life, and more understanding of the difficulties at work. So I think these are some of the things I would say. It doesn't matter where you start, but you can build it up. And if you really want to work on, I would say, in these multilateral organizations, you need to understand what this is. And you need to develop these skills. Even if you start as many of us started locally doing something, but you have to understand how this problem you are working, like this specific research or this intervention or whatever you're doing locally, how this is related to the big picture. If you are able to do that, you are already building up skills that will serve you for life. So I think this is basically this, is how much you want and how open you are to learn new things, and to observe what others do as well. Like learning a different language is also being open to learning a different way of thinking, and then being open to a different type of conversation that is not, I am privileged, I studied, I know a lot about this, so I will help someone. No, you probably will be learning much more when you are open to this exchange. I think it's, to start with, it's good.
May I add to this? I fully agree. This being said, I still think it depends also on, obviously, the job. There are some positions that are much more specialized, right, than others, in the sense I could in WHO never been tasked with managing, I don't know, a concrete project on immunology or, some, I mean, I don't have the competencies, right? So it depends really on the task. So I think that the key entry points, the key needs are those that Agnes have highlighted. And certainly I think there's a high level of array of transferability of knowledge and competencies, right, from one area to the other. At the same time, there might be also areas where you need some kind of specialized training, right? That's not everybody can fulfill, because we have different trainings. And I'm very often sitting, for example, on selection panels for, jobs across the house as an independent, panel member. And certainly you can see people who bring a large number of experiences for that specific requirements, even if they have started somewhere else. But sometimes you also see a large number of people applying, for example, for a position with absolutely, if I may say, no link, right, or no background or no educational background. So I would still be careful, right, to say there are some areas where specialized training certainly is required, and therefore not everybody, I would say, would get that position.
If I make well, I think this is absolutely right. So we would never have a position as coordinating the malaria work if you have no training whatsoever in malaria or TB or asthma, or you need to have the training. But even though this is, and I was in many selection panels, and sometimes the person had this beautiful education, beautiful background and the specifics, but had no clue on what this translated into the policies. And some people, even I saw, they had this idea that once they decided, they would impose this to the ministries of health, and this would change the world, because now they knew the truth about how to treat TB or how to do the certain type of programs. So of course you need the soft skills, I would say, that what I mentioned, otherwise it's impossible to work in this type of environment. But for you cannot be an epidemiologist if you have not been trained as an epidemiologist. But you don't need only to be epidemiologists to work on this. I think this is always a combination.
Thank you both for your insights there. It sounds like a bit of specialized training might be needed, but at the end of the day, it's about compassion, open-mindedness, and the willingness to learn. So thank you. I'm going to pose this question to anyone. So whoever wants to chime in, feel free. Our next question from the chat is, some of the qualifications for these job openings are maybe higher than what students already have. For example, 5 to 8 years of professional experience. How flexible can these requirements be?
I can take that one. It took me a long time to understand the different. So when the UN advertises the positions, it has a very specific code. So there's national officer, there's special categories, there's professional grade, so PG 2 till whatever. And they're not meant for everybody. So the national officer positions are for people that hold citizenship in those countries, and then the qualifications for that is a little bit lower than the PG positions that require the 5 to 8 years of experience. And working with HR and recruiting people for our office, I found that there's not a lot of leeway. So if it says 5 to 8 years experience, but will count this for that experience, like if you have a PhD, it counts towards 2 years or whatever, then that works. But if you can't demonstrate the 5 to 8 years experience, at least in our office, the way that was graded was that you don't meet that requirement. So there's like very set metrics for how your CV is evaluated when it comes in. It really has to speak to the job and the responsibilities and the competencies that have been identified in the key priority areas for that position, and you have to respond to those. So you do that through filling out the P11 package, which takes a lot of time, but it has to be very specific to the job you're applying. And you have to keep updating the P11 every time you add a new experience or you move jobs and so forth. It's very important to meet the criteria. because otherwise you don't get the points, especially if it's like a curmudgeon like me, who's evaluating and scoring. Because at the end of the day, as in research, you want replicability. That means the next person who scores you should also be able to score similarly. So we have to use that rudimentary, framework for scoring. So yeah, and I'll pass it on to anyone else who has experience with recruitment and HR in the U.S.
Maybe I just want to say something from a from a different end of the spectrum. So when I had my first consultancy job offered by the UN or by this FAO and International Atomic Energy Agency, was already, we had a sort of an understanding, we had communications about certain challenges and projects and so forth. And when the announcement came out, it was really tailored towards the person that they wanted. And that's another possibility. And that's the reason why sometimes it's so specific that you think about they need to look for somebody specific. But obviously it can be very well there's somebody else out there that applies and then gets the position. You had to obviously also be prepared for that. But these are short-term positions. Those are just missions that you go on that are for a relatively short time period rather than your job. And you should not shy away from getting into those. And before that, I think even before that, there are so many opportunities of international funding that you as an individual could apply for. Even if it's coming back to UB and doing, having opportunities here is the Fulbright program, for example. That's an international opportunity for you that is designed around your expertise, and you need to make that case. And those are these small projects where things start, and don't think like you need to hit it right on the nail and get a very good position on there. Most likely it's at first uncomfortable and it's challenging, but then it's really something that you are interested in.
Thank you both. So it seems that those qualifications are pretty set. However, there are definitely ways to get to where you want to be in the future. So it looks like we have time for about one more question. So I'm going to pose the last question, I suppose. So anyone can chime in again. And I'm just wondering, what are some of the ways that COVID-19, the pandemic, changed the way that you looked at global health equity? Or maybe affected your work with a UN agency?
Wow, this is challenging, but I think it's a reality check through all kinds of dimension of what you're doing. And I think, us thinking about it's really just like, wow, that's a big question, I must say that through that reality check, I think all of us sort of recalibrated, and maybe we see much clearer, at least from my perspective, I can see a much more clear vision about what to do, because there were a lot of reactions from aspects of my career that I have not experienced before, and very basic things like listening and understanding and communicating, but on the other side also, how does it relate into policy? How do you reach people? And one word that didn't come up is rural. So rural and urban issues and so forth are really, there are all these boundaries that are suddenly coming up that you can see. And those are the boundaries that you should see as a challenge, not, or as an opportunity, but not necessarily as a challenge or something like where you say like, oh, that's too much for me. So I don't know, but I think reality check, that's maybe it.
If I may, I think one of the most difficult parts to see it's not that the pandemic, of course, created a lot of problems, and but it worsened what was already there. So it's more like it was it became so evident that you could not ignore the problems. Of course, we knew where the vulnerabilities were, but then it was there for everyone to see. And I can give you one example. Like I would think we're in in the beginning, 2020, and writing guidelines, what to do if you don't have water and you need to, what do you do with all this wash your hands guidance on COVID. And then we have, suddenly we don't know how many of the healthcare services around our countries do have access to, water all the time, or even energy all the time. So everything became like, it was like an emergency situation, everything is critical. And so the gaps became much more evident. And this has two types of reactions. One is it's everything so big and we are so, little people and not too much money, and everyone is worried about the virus, not about worrying about the people, So this means to get the word out, to have some of the money devoted to solve these issues that are so basic, and I could mention many others here. Even the knowledge on what to do, to use the chemicals. I recall one webinar we organized, and it was related to what to use to clean things, and it was dedicated mostly for healthcare facilities, but it was open. And by that time, we didn't have access, we used online services, but doing webinars for us when we have 200 people, we had a lot. But this, as soon as it was opened, it was like more than 1,000 people, and we could not accommodate. And it was such a big problem because the speakers had not registered. So we had to go through a whole process to be able to do the webinar. So much, we noticed so far behind we were in terms of sharing what we thought it was basic knowledge, and it wasn't. So I think the acute feeling that this inequity problem is not something like we talk and we publish about. It really makes a big difference in the way people can react to emergency situations, and in the way they can survive in emergency situations like this.
Thank you both so much. I agree. I think it opened everyone's eyes around the world to the inequities that we see, that you all have seen before the pandemic. So definitely brought some attention to that. Well, I want to thank everyone who submitted questions, and I want to thank our panelists, and I'll bring it over to Dr. Cordes.
Thanks so much. I wonder if, I know that Dr. Roebbel had her hand up, so I want to give you a chance to, if you want to add anything, to go ahead and do that.
No, I don't know. Agnes actually mentioned many issues that I wanted to mention, but just maybe from a WHO perspective, in the ways of working, it also served, I think, of repurposing, rethinking of how we do work, and really focusing on the concrete country support, right? That we always have been, that was close of our heart, but I think even more being in the countries, the presence in the countries. And this is related even to the way that we have been working, like a lot on teleworking, less travel, less in conferences, and really focusing on providing the best support as possible to countries directly. So I think this is also something that we definitely have been observing. Over.
Thank you. So because we promised that we would end at 4:30, I will go ahead and close out. Thank you so much to our panelists for sharing about your careers and your journeys and your work with the UN. Thank you for taking the time and really being here to mentor students in in what it takes to collaborate and work with UN agencies. Thank you so much, and we appreciate it. And we will post this video for other students who weren't able to attend today, but we'll have an opportunity to hear from you later. So this is us finishing. Thanks so much.
Thank you.